My name is Libby Marcus. I'm Vice President of Health Services at St. John's Lutheran Ministries, and I'm on the board for this wonderful CGEP conference. And today I have the privilege of introducing Monica Trimble. She is a licensed clinical social worker from the Missoula area, and she's been, yes, you can't hear me. I did. But I can't see either. Better? Better? I'll just put it right in my mouth. Okay, today I get to introduce Monica Trimble to you. She's a licensed clinical social worker from the Missoula area, and she's been working at Community Medical Center in acute care and home and community-based services since 1978. And today she's talking to us, 98. 20 years. She looks really good, doesn't she? Today she's going to speak to us on spirituality and the experience of aging. One of the neat things that Monica has done, she is one of the champions and the starter of the Camp to Remember, and that's a camp for young youth that may have lost a significant family member. And so she was the one that started that camp. So I think that's a wonderful, wonderful thing. She's worked home health, hospice, and she's also been on the faculty at the University of Montana. She is experienced in private practice with a focus in geriatrics and grief. And she lives in the Bitterroot Valley with her husband and their 2 dogs. She has 3 adult children. One lives in Missoula, one lives in New York, and one lives in New Orleans. So let's give her a nice warm welcome this afternoon.
Should we take it?
There we go.
Oh, I think I'm live now. Am I live now? Ooh, good. That was very personal attention I was getting there. It is fun to be here with you today. I don't often get to talk to nurses like this. I usually get to talk to social workers. So I do get to work with lots and lots of nurses, though, and have for many years. And I really like working with nurses because they're very practical. They really tell you when you're out in left field and you need to kind of come back to to what's realistic. So I have a really good nurse partner that I work with in home and community-based services. We're a good team, and we have a lot of fun together. She says, if one of us thinks of coffee, the other one says, let's stop. So we really have a good time doing home visits. So this is a fun topic, but it's kind of a hard topic too. And I know that as I look across the room, many of you have probably been practicing for a long time, and like me, you're in that middle age maybe that we now found out was at 55. That I really was happy about that we learned this morning that I'm middle age. It's really, and so this morning I thought I might need to talk a little bit about aging, but I think aging has been covered. So I'm going to jump right into spirituality. I would say we probably have a bunch of baby boomers here in the room, right? How many consider yourself a baby boomer? Oh yeah, we've got a few, yeah. Okay, so we're going to talk today about spirituality and aging, and I'm going to push the buttons here. So what we're going to look at as objectives is to identify the context of religion and spirituality, define gero transcendence as a developmental stage, explore the traditional spiritual roles of elders, define the spiritual needs of older adults, identify opportunities for promoting resilience and transcendence in the aging populations. And here are some that I've identified: disabled adults, adults with memory loss, dementia, end-of-life care, and people with multiple chronic illnesses. Are we religious or spiritual? And this is a map of Montana because this is where we practice and this is where we live. This is a big, big state, and I drove over from Missoula last night and found out about, you know, it's a pretty long way, and I didn't go certainly from border to border. But within that state, what do we have in common in terms of spirituality and religion? Well, we're not in the Bible Belt. Does that surprise anybody? I just thought I'd show you that, just in case you thought we were in the Bible Belt. The Bible Belt is basically those red and pink states there, and they are the states where many people, 30, 40, or 50%, identify themselves as Baptist. Up here, and so if you look at Montana, we have just barely enough people who identify as Catholic to be a blue state in this color scheme. We have on our east Lutherans, those are the Dakotas, and all of the gray states around us don't have enough people who identify with a particular religious group to get a color. They're gray. So we're in the Northwest, which is a pretty unchurched part of the country. Have you seen this country divided like this before? It's pretty interesting, and I think it's interesting when we practice because it tells you who we're working with here. And in Montana, next to Catholics, I do think we have a lot of Lutherans. You know, they've moved over from the Dakotas there, or maybe from Minnesota. But we are not a highly churched part of the world. So when we think about people being religious, we're mostly Catholic, and only 30%, you know, and so I've got some pictures there. I think you probably recognize some of those. Our Lady of the Rockies, Stevensville, the one in the middle there is from my community, and Helena. So as it is used today, the term spirituality refers to an inner subjective region of life that revolves around individual experiences of being, transcending the personal self, and connecting with the sacred. One of the things I was reading says, spirituality is the dimension of human beings that seeks healing. And healing can happen on many levels, and it's not always on the physical level. Everybody needs beauty as well as bread, places to play in, pray in, where nature may heal and give strength to body and soul. This is the Bitterroot River, not too far from our house, and the Bitterroot Mountains on the other side. And I think when we think about spirituality in Montana, many of us look outside, whether it's the Missouri Breaks or the, what is it that goes around Billings, the Rim Rocks? Yeah, that's what we think of a lot of times as the grounding of our being, not just a building or a place. So one of the interesting theories about what happens to older adults is this idea of gero transcendence. And this came from a man in Sweden called Lars Tornström, and you're going to see his name on here. And gero transcendence is an increased awareness of one's own mortality. It is a perspective that death is the completion of the life cycle. It is beyond Erickson's stage of integrity versus despair. Back in, I think it was in the early 60s when Erik Erikson was talking about the developmental stages, that last stage of integrity versus despair, he looked at 55 till death. Well, now we know 55 to 75 is middle age, so we've got to have something beyond that. We need to go beyond integrity versus despair. And some writers call that part of life as the third wave, that opportunity people have even after retirement to do another career. And often people, when they work, after they have, I seem to be oriented to this side of the room, I'm sorry about that. When people take on a second career or a part-time job after 55 or after 65, they can do it according to what they wanted to do in their heart to begin with. Like I really always wanted to be a teacher, or I wanted to be work in a daycare, or I wanted to do something that's more giving back to the community. Now, in my case, and probably in all of your cases, what I'd like for my job at that point is to not deal with people. I'd like to, only work with widgets from that point on. But for lots of people, what they want to do in that third wave at that time is really centered on something they have great passion for. Joining the Peace Corps, doing Teach America or some kind of volunteer work in a school. I think Teach America might be only for younger people, but anyway. A growing sense of one's oneness with nature. How many of us garden as we get older? How many older people garden? Or even tend that pot on the patio? You know, my grandmother grew these great tomatoes in her pots when she was up in her 90s. The need to acknowledge the meaningfulness of one's life, share life's meaning, understanding and wisdom, and express gratitudes and regrets. It's more inward focused sometimes than outward focused. So this gerotranscendence is a developmental theory of positive aging. And this Lars Thornström is from the Uppsala University in Sweden. It is present to some extent, he thinks, in most aging adults. And according to his theory, it becomes prevalent mainly in adults over 30. So when you're getting out of middle age, then you can start thinking about this transcendence. Although, as we know, as practitioners and as ourselves, that we do start looking at the world a little differently as we age. So you don't really need a quick review of Maslow's theory hierarchy of needs, but the reason I put this slide in is many of our elders and older adults are still working on some of those in the primary section. The food, drink, shelter, warmth. You know, we know there are people who don't have those basic needs met. They have food insufficiency. They don't have enough money in their Social Security to pay the rent, buy the medication, and buy food. So for some people, it's really hard to work on those secondary needs, which are more spiritual needs, when you don't come and go here? Yeah. Okay. I'm going to have to put my head in exactly the right spot. So we know that sometimes older adults really are still struggling with real basic needs. And some spiritual needs are needs and expectations which humans have to find meaning, purpose, value in their life. These needs can be specifically religious, but even people who have no religious faith or are not members of organized religion have belief systems that give their lives meaning and purpose. And everyone starts looking at those needs or expectations. So in the past, we most cultures saw elders as revered in some way or another. And it was assumed that that there was a spiritual element to this, that wasn't just that they were, had lived longer and knew more, but they also were keepers of tradition, and they had benefited from years of spiritual development. And we have that in our culture. I put examples of Native American culture in here because we still call them elders in tribal communities, but we also in our own communities, we have people that we see as holders of, well, this person knew what this community was like before the shopping mall went in, before the development went in. They remembered when lots of different things happened. So, and I also put Jimmy Carter in there because I thought he's kind of an elder in a lot of ways. Elizabeth Macamoot, she's from Canada, Canadian, and it says here that speaking only her native language, she feels lonely. Very few of the younger generation still speak Anishinaabe, I guess, language, creating a gap with the elders and contribute to the loss of traditional values where women were respected. First Nation people believed that women share the same spirits of the Mother Earth. So there were traditions that carried on a spiritual component to them, and I think we all hope that those traditions aren't going to be lost. For many, religion and spirituality are important resources for coping with the challenges of aging. And then I just listed some of the challenges there. We know from both qualitative and quantitative research that for many people, they use spirituality or faith as the main coping mechanism when they have the trials and pain associated with disease and aging. And I'm sure that you are aware of that too. That's a really important support for most older adults. Serious chronic illness is an invention of the latter part of the 20th century. Often, patients with chronic illnesses have unmet spiritual needs. Now, this statistic comes from research with cancer patients, but I know you know too that cancer is often a chronic illness now. We don't see it as much as an acute illness as a chronic illness. And many patients with advanced cancer report their spiritual needs were minimally supported by the medical system, but they were not very well supported by the religious community either. So I think it leaves an opening or a gap for healthcare professionals to step into and promote spiritual development and growth in our patients and in our clients, because it seems like that's not really happening very well. At least people aren't reporting that it's happening well. And when people have multiple chronic symptoms, multiple illnesses, patient struggles with chronic symptoms can bring about feelings of guilt, loss, sadness, anxiety, diminished self-esteem, loss of role function, communication problems with family and friends, and questions about the meaning of life. And of course, those are all religious and faith struggles. The important question, why me? Many people have that sense that out of the, I'm going to have to keep my voice going this way, that they're being painted as someone that has more chronic illness, more sadness, more grief than somebody else. And then they have to try to think about why. What does that relate to in my life? Actively giving is associated with life satisfaction. Even people with multiple illnesses, if they feel like they can contribute, then they have report an increased quality of life. This is my mother. She was at my house a couple weekends ago, and I had been working on this quilt for about 10 years, and she was really eager to help me get it finished. And she babysits my sister's kids who are in grade school. She gets them to school in the morning, she gets them after school, and it was really a big deal for her to come to Montana. She said, well, I'm having to leave my job for about 5 days to come to Montana. And I said, you know, I think my sister can actually get her own children off to school. Really, it's very important to her. She has arthritis, she has chronic pain in her knee, the knee replacement that went very bad. And, you know, she has high blood pressure. I mean, she has a whole list of things. But as long as she can be contributing, she feels much more connected to the world and distracted from her own pain. She also is like so many people that volunteering is a really important thing for improving quality of life. And people who are connected to churches, faith communities, who have a spiritual dimension in their lives are more likely to volunteer. And then that is kind of that circle of, you know, I'm contributing so I feel better, I'm less focused on my pain or my chronic illness. It's pretty easy to focus on chronic illness when you're home by yourself all day. The term actively giving comes from some research that Harold Koenig did, and if any of you have read anything in spirituality and healthcare, I'm sure you've read his work. So how do we interpret suffering and pain? This is the spiritual dimension that comes into suffering and pain. Is it punishment? A trial to learn a spiritual lesson, a path to spiritual awareness, bad luck? And sometimes that's the really easiest one to accept. It's just really bad luck that I have this condition and I have this chronic pain. Or is it a family curse? My family, all my uncles have diabetes, all my family has chronic back pain. You know, people interpret these things differently, and it makes a difference in how you see yourself, in how you see suffering and pain. Viktor Frankl was the person who wrote about suffering and meaning, and he said suffering without meaning is what is so dehumanizing, and he talked about suffering in the concentration camps in logotherapy came out of some of his work. But if we can reframe suffering or hardship, then sometimes we can reframe how we see the outcome of that. I'm not sure that I mean, you know, that I don't know the answer to how people do that, but I'm sure you know people who have done that, who have been able to take pain, suffering, hardship, grief, and make something out of that that comes out more positive. I think end-of-life care was probably the beginning of incorporating in this country. I mean, we have always had faith-based hospitals and institutions that had chaplains, but end-of-life care and hospice, Cicely Saunders is supposedly the founder of the modern hospice movement, and she emphasized the total pain, spiritual, psychological, as well as physical aspects. And when Medicare started doing hospice reimbursement in, what, 86, I think, 1986, somewhere in the 80s, every team was required and is still required to have a chaplain. So that was the beginning of recognition of an interdisciplinary team that included aspect. Certainly, if we don't look at spiritual care at end of life, I'm really not sure where we are going to look at spiritual care. One of our local guys, Ira Byock, the hospice doctor that I was lucky enough to work with in Missoula for several years, wrote this book, 4 Things That Matter Most, and he took these 4 phrases, please forgive me, I forgive you, thank you, and I love you, as really the 4 things that need to be addressed at the end of life. And these are really spiritual. These are really spiritual aspects of a person's life. Forgiveness is huge in the literature of spiritual care. And not every faith tradition looks at forgiveness the same way. So when you're working with someone and they talk about forgiveness, whether it's, I need to forgive myself for things that I did as a parent or as a spouse, or I need to forgive my children for whatever, sometimes it takes more listening and investigation to find out, what does that person think forgiveness is? Is it never mentioning that topic again? Or is it really wiping the slate clean as if this... Lots of ways that we think about forgiveness, and as I said, be curious about what your patient or your client thinks that is. I have a little note here to myself that says we're about half time, so I have to make sure I'm halfway along those slides. Gratitude is also the thank you, and I think a life of gratitude is often a spiritual pathway when we can see gratitude as in part of our everyday living. Also, older adults have also had to cope with death as a spiritual crisis. And I've done a lot of work in grief. I've done quite a lot of grief counseling. And people see a death, especially a death of a loved one, as a spiritual crisis. And what happens next? What do I think about what I've learned from my church? What do I think about what I've learned from my family? Does this still continue to make sense to me? And if you live to be middle age of that, 50 years old or 60, although probably most of us aren't going to live to be 120, but if you live to be 60, 70, 80, 90, you have had many of these inevitable losses: grandparents, parents, uncles, aunts, siblings, spouse. But you've also had the unexpected losses: miscarriages, young children, adult children. No matter how old you grow or live to be, you never expect that your child is going to die before you. And that's always something that has to be wrestled with and reckoned with. Siblings, and sometimes an unexpected loss of a spouse. My sister at 38, her husband died suddenly at 40. Now that was 10 or 12 years ago. She's raised her children, she got remarried, she's kind of moving on with her life. She will never forget the day that they called her and her husband died at the racquetball court. I mean, that was a defining moment in her life. And if she lives to be 100, that day will still be implanted in her memory. And I'm sure all of us have those days in our own lives that the world changed. And usually it was an unexpected loss that happened, an unexpected death or a tragedy. And then we have to think about, what do we believe? This is a picture, this is a painting by a woman named Kathy Weber. You can see her signature there at the bottom. She did a lot of painting. She was a very accomplished artist while her husband was dying at a fairly young age. I think he might have been in his 40s. But she describes grief as encircling her as she lived through this death of her husband. And I quoted here Gretchen Strohmeyer, who is a hospice worker in Missoula. Grief is sometimes described as a roller coaster experience for the mind, body, and spirit, and feels as though the griever will be sent spinning out of control, off the tracks. Spirit may no longer seem abstract. Many people begin to experience their spirit in very physical and tangible ways. I feel like I lost you there. Oh, okay. And my spirit feels oppressed, as if a is sitting on my lungs. Grief become his spirit. So, am I cutting in and out?
Yeah, take a look real quick, sorry.
Okay, sure.
Okay, pull it off this time.
Sure. I may get it rewired.
It says the battery's good,
Okay.
but I'm going to change them anyway. Okay, you live?
Okay, am I here? Oh yeah, good. That's good. Okay. There's also the impact on older adults of complicated grief, accident, suicide, murder, conflicted relationships, the need to forgive or be forgiven. One of the quotes that I keep in my office is, "We are what we are given and what is taken away." Each person who becomes an older adult, brings with him or her a lot of losses, and that defines who that person is. I spent a little bit of time talking about dementia and spirituality because I think that's a really hard one, so that I spent a little bit more time on it. This is from an article that I have in the references, and it's called Holding On to Hope. Dementia is characterized by cognitive loss, memory resulting in decline, you know all that, and grief, and of course there's grief with those losses. So loss is really the defining feature of dementia. And so it's very hard as healthcare professionals to feel hopeful when we know that someone has a dementia diagnosis. It is a really tough place to go, and as a family member, that is also a really hard place to feel there's any hope. What the article talks about and what the experts talk about is that in dementia, if we can promote integrity and dignity, that helps people with dementia to have a better quality of life. So they talk about things like music therapy, validation therapy, narrative therapy. There's a lot of work going on with narrative therapy in storytelling, using pictures to ask a person with dementia to tell me a story about this picture. What do you think is happening here? Maybe some of you heard that on NPR the other morning on the morning show, the morning edition. They talked about how even if a person with dementia is not really oriented to time and place right now, they can look at a picture and say, this person looks happy. Maybe they just went on vacation. They can make up a story about that. Reminiscence is always really important because a lot of times with Alzheimer's disease, the person can have very clear memories, of course, as you know, of the things that happened 50 or 60 years ago. And this stimulation is very interesting because it's using sensation, touch, taste, and aroma to give pleasure. And if you can laugh when you have dementia, what's better in your day than that? To find something pleasurable, whether it's the tickling of your face or the smell of a fragrance that maybe brings back memories. There's some powerful things that we can do with the senses. It says loss of dignity is associated with high levels of psychological and spiritual distress. In some people, the loss of the will to live. And I think we've seen that in people with dementia. This is a picture of my sister Emily and my Aunt Bud. And my Aunt Bud lives in New York. And this is one of those situations where I do a lot of case management from Montana for her in New York. She lives by herself. and in a little trailer house, and she has pretty advanced dementia. But because she doesn't take any medication, she's continent, and she doesn't go out of her house, she's pretty safe at home. And with caregivers, they come in a few hours every day. She's there right now at 92 and doing quite well. But I took her to the doctor when I was there a while back, and I said, she can't take medicine. She wouldn't know what day it is. She might take it 3 times in the same day. And she hadn't been to a doctor in probably 10 years. And so the doctor looked at me and said, well, then we won't do any tests. So I thought, well, that's good, because if you do a test, you're going to give her medicine. So, but she's very happy in her trailer home, but she is very far from any of our family. I live in Montana. My cousin who helps with her lives in Florida. My sisters and brother all live in Illinois. But she asks about them every time. How's your mother doing? Because my dad, her brother, died, and so she will say, how's your mother doing? How's Emily? How's, Marcy? Did her husband die? She asks all these questions. That connectedness to family is really important, even though she's miles from anybody. So in terms of creating hope in the face of deterioration, focus on the moment, let go of expectations, remember what is still good, listen, connect, touch, and comfort, provide comfort. That's one of the things that people can do for their loved one. I'm not going to read this poem, but it's in your thing, and it's got a nice ending to it. Doris is a woman who I had a long relationship with. I got connected with her doing some grief work, and later I got into reading to her because she had about 750 letters from her husband who had written to her during World War II. And she had a stroke, and she was very depressed. I did the geriatric depression scale with her. She was probably one of the most, scored about as high as you could. But her faith was so important and so strong that she would say, I could never kill myself because that would be wrong in my belief system. I don't think she could possibly have physically done that anyway, but she was very, very depressed. So reading to her gave her that reminiscence of her when she was a young, vibrant woman, when she could walk. After her stroke, she couldn't walk, she couldn't toilet herself, she could feed herself, she couldn't read, she'd been an avid reader, but her caregivers would read to her. Her caregivers would let her do the crossword puzzle because they would fill it out and she would provide the answers. And her faith was really important to her. And I went to see her every week for about 5 or 6 years. And after we got to know each other really well, she would always say to me, I'm praying for your children. Now, is there a nicer thing that somebody could do for you than pray for your children? I don't even pray that much for my own children, so, and they need it. But she would say that to me, and I know she had a really long prayer list of people that she thought about every day. And in her chair, in a very, very small world, her husband, who had been her caregiver, had died suddenly. But anyway, she was able to continue to contribute by praying for a lot of people in the world. And she certainly didn't see her stroke as a gift. She was a very active person who felt that she had really been wronged somewhere along the way. But she still was able to contribute. I had to put the Missouri break because I had those mountain pictures, and I thought maybe we should at least have one. And I thought this was a gorgeous picture of the Missouri break. Ram Dass is considered one of the kind of alternative spiritual leaders in this country. I'm not quite sure if he's still alive yet, but he had a stroke, and I thought what he said about his stroke was very interesting. The stroke has been what I call heavy grace, to take the external silence and use it as a vehicle to go into the silence of the heart. The kernel of what wisdom is about cannot be clothed in normal words. It cannot be said. That silent place inside is the place in you that brings you close to God. I wanted to talk a little bit, now we're kind of moving into the what can we do as practitioners to encourage transcendence and spirituality in our patients that we work with. Mine are now clients, so if I say clients and patients, I'm sure as nurses you work mostly. But ritual is very important. I listed some religious rituals, and if you've worked in hospitals, you know that for some people, especially at the end of life, or if you've worked in hospice, having a visit from the priest or the pastor can be a very important part of the end-of-life experience. But for other people, there are other rituals that are important. Even hearing a familiar scripture or a familiar prayer, the Lord's Prayer. But also, cultural rituals are important, and they're important to keep life interesting, to keep dignity and that spark in life. So, even if a person has dementia or is in a nursing home, we still need to remember birthdays, anniversaries, graduations, holidays, those important things that make our own calendar. We all have an internal calendar as well as the one that we put on the wall. And it's important to remember some of those special days that we remember for our family or for ourselves. And even asking somebody that you work with, what days are important to you? Are there some times of the year that are important to you? And you might find out something that you can help commemorate for them. I put all these candle pictures in because I've found in my practice that a candle ritual is just about as powerful as anything. And if I'm working with, when I worked with Doris, the woman who was so depressed and had this stroke, I asked, she was talking about how hard it was for her husband. And I said, well, you need a candle for Otis, a big fat candle for Otis. And when you are thinking about him and you really want to feel close to him, light that candle. And you don't know how many times I would come on Saturday afternoon and her Otis candle would be lit. For her, that became a ritual that helped her connect with her husband who had died. And I think I've used it in grief therapy a lot. I've used it, and look at the rituals here on the pictures. We use candlelight as a part of most of our significant rituals, and you probably do in your own life too. I don't know why it's so powerful, but it is. This is my husband's grandfather and his second wife, and they just had a delightful 30 years together, and he was 70 when they got married. They were pretty healthy, and she had had a very bad, abusive relationship in her first marriage, and she wasn't very sure she wanted to get married again. But he started courting her, and in just a few months, they were married. He got married within 6 months or so after his wife died of a very long illness. Their first date was going to the cemetery to look at different tombstones that might be appropriate for his wife. But she felt like she had such a wonderful life with him. She never wanted for anything. They had money. They had a big farm in central Illinois. They were very modest people, but they just enjoyed being together, as you can see in this picture. And they had, they had supportive family, but they really enjoyed their life together. And I think for older adults to have an opportunity at 70 to remarry, and the family thought, oh, if they have 5 good years together, won't that be nice? Or if they have 10 good years together. But they had 30 good years together, so he died at 104. So we're getting to in conclusion here. The people who see themselves as having spiritual experiences, as being a spiritual person on a spiritual journey, and having experienced direct connection with the sacred, are qualitatively different from people who see nothing spiritual in their lives. How people answer the question, what is life about, matters very much for how they experience aging and how aging affects their experience. I think that's not, it's a kind of a big paragraph, but it's something we all know intuitively, is that meaning in life continues as we age. And what is life about is really the question we probably each ask ourselves every day. And so, of course, older adults ask themselves that question too. I also like this picture. I think many older adults are very connected to their pets. And that is a very grounding and kind of a wholesome way to continue to care for creation. My grandmother was a big bird woman. She raised chickens and pheasants and turkeys and ducks. And when she got up into her 80s, she raised canaries. She had little canaries in her apartment, and that caring for something is a real connection to transcendence. It's not just about me, but I'm also walking the dog or cuddling the cat or feeding the canaries. There is more work to be done. Even with our existing simple measures, we can say with mild confidence that people who pay more attention to their inner lives as they age appear to have less fear of death, experience less stress, have more positive attitude in the face of difficulties such as disability and bereavement. And what we mean by simplistic measures is just asking the simple question, do you consider yourself a spiritual person? Just knowing the answer to that question, or do you have a faith tradition that's important to you? Asking a very simple question like that can open the door to a discussion about spirituality. So you don't have to have a long 5-page spiritual assessment. Just asking someone if they think they're a spiritual person, or if they have is your faith important to you, is the key to opening that door. And that's when I go to my happy place, that's what it looks like.
Do we have any, do we have any questions for Monica? Okay.
You talked about, you talked about volunteering. I find a lot of the depression age people that went through that, they've been maybe volunteering and helping other people, but when it comes to them needing help, they have this crisis of accepting that. I don't know if that is something you can comment on.
I agree. I agree with that. What the question or comment was that people who have really had to rely on themselves over the years are often very reluctant to accept help from volunteers or their family. I don't want my daughter in my house. I can do that perfectly well myself. I think ideally, if we could help people understand that it is also a gift to receive help, to say, your daughter really wants to help you, and this is something she can do for you. That's the gold standard. I don't think we can always reach that. At least I can't with my family. But maybe some of you have other ideas about how to help people see that receiving is also part of the equation. It's not always giving. Other comments or questions? Does any of this seem to ring true with what your experience is? Do you find that you, yes?
What if you have a patient who doesn't show, well, he denies any spirituality and is very depressed? Do you do that?
That's a good question. You can repeat it.
What if you have a patient or a friend who just says, well, I'm not religious, but he's very depressed and even thinking of hurting himself? I mean, what do you do spiritually with that?
Well, I think that if you have someone that is showing signs of what you might, I mean, there's places that you can see these are signs of spiritual distress. Probably it's good not to use the spiritual and religious language, to skip that language and go to something like, what's important to you now? Is there something that you'd still like to do? Is there anything that has been left undone? Because for many people, and you know, from the map, we have a lot of unreligious, unspiritual people that live in our communities, but something is probably meaningful to them. So I think if we change the language and ask about, you know, what's still important? Is there anything important that's left undone? Is there anything that you still are worried about? Then that might shift. But I don't claim to have all the answers on that. Certainly, each of you may have had experiences where you've been able to, you know, you're looking at a spiritual distress, but you can't go through that door. You have to go around some other way. But that is a hard one. Other comments?
Any other comments?
I thought it was just interesting that you mentioned that we invented depression in the end of the 20th century.
Chronic illness.
Chronic illness. Okay.
Chronic illness. Because people used to not die of, we couldn't live with diabetes before. We couldn't live with CHF before. So chronic illness is really, you know, people in the early 1900s didn't have to worry about that. You just died, and then you were, gone. But now we can live with multiple chronic illnesses.
I think this discussion is really very important and very valuable. I think if personally we in our own families, first within ourselves and then our families, for me, there are 4 generations, and we have such differences. But I think to not talk about them is a disservice. Sometimes we have to speak without words. And there is a lot of unfinished business for all of us, and so much to offer, from the elderly to the young and the young to the elderly. So I think it just takes one person in a family to utilize their sphere of influence to pull those strings together. I kind of visualize sewing and smocking those rows and being the one that pulls those strings together. And we all want to belong to family and to be nurtured by that. And I think that, and to leave a legacy. The age and stage that I am is preparing to leave a legacy, and I can't do that unless I know what has been of value in my life. Absolutely. And to share that. Mm-hmm. And I see a 7-year-old grandson who, he's so full of vitality, but he needs to be, trained like a colt. He needs, and he needs the parent and the grandmother and the grandfather to participate. It takes a village. So I think if we ourselves are kind of settled, and we have that opportunity to think about that today, we'll have more to offer our clients, our patients, our elderly, and I'm finding the biggest challenge is the 30-year-olds for me, to share my wisdom and to love unconditionally. So I think we're challenged today, and it's of great value to discuss that.
Thank you. I appreciate that because I think it is true. It's really hard to help someone open the door to transcendence or the spiritual development if we ourselves are not open to that idea. Are we getting the high sign that we're done?
We need to give you all a break, so you have about 15 minutes before we come back here and listen to Dr. Clayton Small. Thank you
Thank you
very much.